Hi, this is Richard, and we are continuing with the beginner Blender tutorials to get you up and running in Blender. Now we're going to be talking about our properties window. Like I said in the last video, if you've followed along through all the videos, you are almost not a beginner anymore. If you understood everything and you have been doing some practice, you've probably got a pretty good handle on most of it. Now these buttons over here are your properties to further help you do what you want and to really round out your beginner status, move you into intermediate. So we're going to talk about these. Yes, this is a window over here. We can drag it and change it just like a window. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention in the last video is that you can add new windows. See these little hash marks up here or here in the corner? You can just grab those and drag those across and add a new window like that. And if you do this by accident, don't worry, it's really easy to get rid of it. Just drag these from the ones you want to keep, and you'll see this arrow moving across the screen. That means it's going to move this one and collapse the other one. There we go, I've removed it. And that's a way to further change this to really meet the setup that you need. And one other fancy trick that I'd like to show off, if you hold Shift and you click in this corner, that same corner we just did, it's going to make that whole window its own window so that you can move it onto your second screen if you have two screens. I do that quite a bit to just have a 3D view on one screen and then I can work in quad view on the other so that I don't have all of these toolbars cluttering up my workspace. I only have them on one monitor. Really handy tool, that's Shift, and you just click up here to create a new window outside of the program, or you can just click here and drag it to create a new viewport window inside the program. Click it and drag it across one to collapse them. So let's get started over here in the Properties window. First button that should load up is the Render, this little camera. And these are all your render settings. Here you click Render to render just one image. Here to make a whole animation, let's click it. And you're going to see these little boxes going around rendering all of the light, and it produces an image. Now I don't have a world set up. I don't have my light set up. This is a pretty ugly render. It's still got some speckles all in here because my samples are really low. There's some problems with it. It's not that great, but it did it. F11 took me out of that, and F12 will re-render it. F12 is a hotkey for that. F11 takes you out. If you just want to look at the image you made again, hit F11 again, and I'm back in it. Or you can go down here and change this to UV Image Editor. That's where it shows you the render. And you can zoom in and zoom out with your mouse wheel, and you can drag it around with the middle mouse button. And then if you click and drag, it'll show you some information about the colors and things that are on screen, and coordinate systems and things like that. So that's the render button. Animation is going to animate the frames based on a timeline. Here's the first frame going, and it finishes. Here's the second frame going, and I'm not going to go through all 250 of these. It would take a while, and I'm going to try and make this one quicker, I promise. I said that last time, and it ended up being about twice as long as the one before it. So this one will probably be 2 hours. I'm sorry. If you want to stop this, you just go up here and hit the X to stop your render. Or you can hit Escape. Let's hit F12, start that rendering, Escape, and it leaves you with what was rendered. I mean, so a lot of this stuff is intermediate, so I'm going to go fairly fast over it. Let's get back there. And dimensions, render presets, you can just leave this. This sets the resolution. This is how much of that resolution you're going to use for your render. You can scale it all the way to 100 to get it to be a 1080 picture like your HD. I'll leave it at 50. That's generally good enough. For your final image, you might want to change that. It does take a lot longer, about 4 times as long, because half the resolution, half of this X, half of that Y, is 1/4 of the total size. And then if you do use animation, you can start it at a certain frame, end it at a certain frame, and change the frame rate. Things like that are really handy as well. Add a border, add a stamp right here. You can add text color, you can add all sorts of things. And then output. This is the folder where it's going to save your image when it renders it. And then when you save it, let's hit F12 and let's render this out. And let's let it finish. Now it's finished. It saved this. put the stamp on it. Okay, see, and that's what the stamp does. But it saved this to this temp folder that's specified here. You can change that to whatever you want. Then, if you want to save this as a final image and not have it sitting in a temp folder where it might get overwritten, hit F3, and you can save it wherever you want. And you can add bookmarks here in your save locations. These are your recent locations. It's pretty straightforward that way. And one other thing, F3. Now, if I was going to see if I click on one of these other files, these are all my save files I have in this location. If I click on it, this goes red because it shows me I'm going to overwrite my current save. Sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes not. Just be aware. And then you can change how it saves. So, bitmap, IRIS-PNG, JPEG, Targa, all these different ways to save things, and how to save it as a movie. If you're just doing little 5-6 frame movies, little 10-second max movies, you can choose one of these. Otherwise, you're going to want to make a movie in a different way, and that is an advanced video. But if you're just doing a quick animation, you can choose one of these, and it'll save it as that format when it's finished rendering. But generally, I leave it on PNG because I figure it's the most lossless way to compress an image in the smallest file size. I really like PNG, and it can have an alpha channel for transparencies. That's what this is. It's going to save it as black and white, red, green, blue, or red, green, blue, alpha. I just leave that red, green, blue, alpha checked all the time so that I always have the option of the transparency being a part of it. Otherwise, it might cause some issues if you start using that. Color depth, 8-bit, 16-bit, I'll leave it on 16. It just looks nicer. And your compression, you can change that. 100's maximum lossless compression. It's going to be a lot slower, so 0 is no compression. Just, you can leave it at the default. Sampling, this is where you change this here. Let's put this at 5, and let's re-render this. See all this noise, all this gritty noise? That is the light reflecting, and for each pixel, it's only thought about that 5 times. So for each pixel, it only thinks about it 5 times. You get a bunch of noise. Let's put this down to 2. Watch, it's going to render super fast. Bam, it's done, but I have a bunch of this noise. It's not real pretty. Down to 1. Wow, it's really noisy. It's kind of ugly. You kind of get an impression, but it's super fast. Now let's put that back on 50 so you can see the difference between what I was doing and what I'm doing now. It's a lot slower, but I get a much nicer image. The noise is almost ignorable. This is pretty good setting for just a preview to check things out. When you hit F12, that's rendering it. So it's this render samples. Now if I do 500, I'm not going to do this whole thing, but you can watch how slowly it goes. That one, here we go, it's going. It takes a little while. The more lights you have, the more materials you have. If you have particle effects, it needs to think about those, calculate them, and this is going to take a really long time depending on your computer. And let's stop it there. But now you can see there's a lot less noise where there was a lot of noise before. It takes care of a lot of noise. If you have a bunch of glass and reflections and refractions and light bouncing in all these different directions, a good thing you can do is this clamp indirect. That's going to clamp down the indirect light and reduce some of that bouncing noise. I just like to put mine at 0.6. That's all I'm going to say about clamp. 0.6 is great. This is your random seed. It's going to change up the value of this noise a little bit and how it thinks about those pixels. But clamp indirect light is 0.6. If you're getting a bunch of noise, even when you're rendering at a lot of samples, just clamp it to 0.6 and try again. This clamping at 0.6 allows me to render pretty complex things at about 100, 200 to get a general idea of how good it's going to look, and it goes a lot faster than having to turn this up into the thousands. That's the other way to get rid of all of that annoying noise, because you might get one really bright pixel of light. In the Blender community, those are called fireflies, and you might get bunches of them of where light is reflected directly at the camera. It'll be really bright little pixels of light. They're really ugly. Indirect clamp gets rid of those so that you don't have to turn this up to 10,000. Now, preview. What does that mean? Preview is if I was to change this right here from solid to rendered. Now it's actually rendering my viewport in cycles. And I move this around and it gets all fuzzy, and then it has to re-render and it looks better and better and better. The preview is set to 10, so it's going to stop after 10 samples. You can see that right here. See? 10 out of 10. Now let's get out of that real quick so I can delete these. And Shift-Z will take us back in it. This preview is for the viewport. Now see it counting up to 50? And this looks a lot better, but then I change it, and it has to go all the way back up to 50 again. I don't really recommend working with it rendering in your viewport like this, because it's got to do that every single time. If you just want a quick look, a quick peek at what it looks like, you can go in there real quick, change it around a bit, and wait a little bit and see what it's going to look like, and then pop out of it. That's helpful, but I wouldn't recommend actually modeling in that. So that's sampling. The more render samples you have, the better your image is going to look when you hit F12. But the longer it's going to take. And you can also hit this button right here to start your render as well. And that button also goes off of these same settings. These are the properties for rendering, and it's the only place that you're going to be manipulating those properties. And then volume sampling, light paths, motion blur, film, performance. You don't really have to worry about those things until you get into the intermediate level, advanced level. Performance is ways to speed things up. You can change, like, the little boxes that are going. Those are 64 by 64 pixels, and that's set right here. You can change that size. I wouldn't really mess with it. That can change up the speed of your rendering. Start resolution, dynamic, things like that. When you get to a point that you need those extra seconds, then look into those things. You don't need to mess with them too much right now. Post-processing, compositing sequencer. Compositing, I would say, would qualify as intermediate. Choose rendering mode, that's an add-on I have. I'm not going to go over that. So this here is what I want to talk about last in the render button. Right here, I have GPU compute and CPU. It starts default at CPU. So now you're just rendering with your computer, with your Intel AMD chip, what have you. And see, it's going a lot slower because, well, my computer's also running my computer. I have a pretty fast CPU. It's just this is how much it could devote to this. So CPU is great. It is going to be slower than using your graphics card, but it's great at doing really, really complex stuff. It's not going to stall out. I had a really big scene that needed about 4 gigs of RAM to render it, and you can watch this memory right up here. It would go up, 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 all the way to 4, and it would quit, and it would stop, and I wouldn't get my whole image because it was maxing out my graphics processor, my GPU, my graphics card. I switched it to CPU, and it took forever, but it did it, and it finished it, and that's why you would use CPU. But if you have an NVIDIA graphics card, I recommend a GTX or higher. Well, I mean, there's not much. GTX is the best range of cards. I recommend a GTX NVIDIA card. You can go up here to File, User Preferences, and then go to System, and then here, under Compute Device, switch it from None to CUDA, and then in this drop-down list, choose your graphics card. And then, whoops, System, Compute Device, CUDA, choose your graphics card, save user settings. You have to save this, otherwise it won't leave it set up. And then over here in your render button on your properties window, you will have, under Device, the option to change it to GPU Compute. It's faster. It looks nicer. I recommend it. Now, all of this we are doing in Cycles Render up here. I recommend Cycles because I think it's going to get a lot better into the future, where Blender Render was the original. It's going to kind of be left behind. That's my personal opinion. Don't hold me to it. Render layers, okay, you don't really need to use that as a beginner. Your scene, you don't really need to worry about scenes as a beginner. World, this is interesting. We're going to make our render look a lot better very, very quickly. You can change the properties of this world. See, this is your world. That color matches this drab color, this drab, boring gray. Blender is so beautiful with all its different gray tones, isn't it? Just gray on gray on gray. It's so exciting. And this world, when we render, that gray, drab world is reflected off of all of these surfaces of light, and it makes everything look gray and boring. In the normal world, there's light coming from all angles, and you don't even really notice it because that's how our eyes evolved, was to capture all of this bouncing light. And there's none of that right now. There's just one light source and a gray, empty world. So what can you do really quickly and easily? Well, we can change this color and make it more exciting. Now we've got a red background. But you have the same problems. Look, it's reflecting this red color now, and you still just have one light source, and it's still just as boring. Let's right-click and reset to default value. Whoa! That's weird. I thought it would have set it back to the gray, but it went to black. Okay. Now, you just see what I did. I hit Use Nodes. Okay, there's a Use Nodes button here. Let's just do this so that I can show you again. I just went to File, New, Reload Startup File. That'll give you a new cube. We'll start over. Here, under World, it's a little globe. Under Surface, I clicked Use Nodes. Nodes are pretty cool. You can use them for a lot once you understand them. It's a really easy way to think about things. I'm just going to click Nodes, and I'm not going to go down here to the node editor or do anything with that. We're just going to stay in this menu to make it super simple. Now, once I click Use Nodes, I have this background option. Don't worry about it, don't mess with it. I have this color option, which is our drab gray, and I have this strength. Strength is how much the world shines its own light on your cube. Let's turn that down to 0 and render this again. See, there's no light. We can turn this up to 5, and there will be a bunch of light from the world around it. At 1, it's just your normal default setting. Normal drab gray. Pretty boring. This little button here, this little square with a little dot in it, click that guy. We're going to go to Environment Texture. Environment Texture right here on that pop-up menu. Now we have these new options. You have to go to the internet and download an HDRI, High Dynamic Range image, or imaging. And then you download your HDRI, you can put it in here, and that's going to shine light from all different angles from a panoramic picture. Somebody takes a panoramic picture and gives it some properties, and then it will shine its light like you're wrapping this cube in a panoramic picture and placing it in that world. It's a very quick, very easy way to add some good complex lighting to a scene. So we'll click Open, and I have mine saved here, and let's just do Rome Market. It's a good default one. Now I'm going to re-render this, and I have my Rome Market in the background, and it's sending light from all different directions. You'll get a much better result, especially with complex materials and complex models. I highly recommend going to get some HDRI images and putting them in the backgrounds. Even if you don't see the HDRI, it's good to have it there so that you get that light bouncing off of your objects the way that so that it's more realistic. And moving on, these are your object properties and location. Okay, let's get out of our UV image editor. Location, you know, you can transform it here, you can rotate it here, you can scale it here. If you need to do specific rotation scale locations, this is a good place to do it. You can do a specific angle of rotation, a specific amount of scale, or a specific translation of your object. And you also have it here on your properties panel. I don't know why. In hides that and lets you view it. Oh, restarting turned off my screencast keys. Let's turn that on. I would just go here to your object properties. Delta transform, transform locks. This is just locking it to your different axes. Relations, parenting, not going to worry about that in the beginner course, or groups. Display the name on each object, that can be handy. Display the axis. See, now I have a Y and an X, and there's a Z there. If you need help remembering. Also, there's this little widget down in the bottom here, XYZ, that's going to help you remember your orientation as well. It tries to match up to the world so that you can have a quick look down there if you can't see your world axes on this grid, or you have your transform tool turned off. That little widget down there helps align you in this, because you're kind of floating in space here. Wire, it'll show you the edges of your objects, that can be handy as well. Draw all edges, I don't know, bounds of your bounding box. Like if I add a sphere, well, where is it? Oh, I put my 3D cursor way up there. Sorry, I forgot about that. There's my sphere. Let's do bounds. See, there's the bounding box. Cylinder bounds, cone bounds. This is helpful for knowing if you're doing collision and things like that. It's helpful for knowing how it's going to collide, because you can change that as well. Let's turn that off. And then texture space, X-ray, transparency. So just different options for how to display different your objects, and you have to change between your objects as well. Because see, let's do name on that one and bounds on that one. See, it doesn't do it for both of them. You have to do it individually. If you select multiple, it'll do multiple. Turn those off. Duplication, you know, I mean, don't really mess with that. Do it over here. For beginners, motion paths, don't have to worry about custom properties, ray visibility. Don't worry about any of that. You don't need it to get started. Constraints, we're going to skip it. It just adds a constraint to your objects. There are reasons you would need these, not really as a beginner. I don't really want to get into talking about it. It's getting away from the purpose of the video. Modifiers, this will be important. This is kind of towards the end of your beginner learning. Getting into modifiers, really, once you start getting into them, I think that would segment you as an intermediate Blender user. Because as a beginner, you're going to be deforming things, making things, doing things kind of the hard way. And then when you get into modifiers, your life is going to get a lot easier, and you're going to wonder why you didn't start with them in the first place. So, modifiers. These are simple ways to add different things. Like a bunch of cubes in this direction. And they don't actually exist until, see, I can't click them in edit mode. I can only change this one, and it changes all of them. They don't actually exist until you hit apply. See, now I applied it, and they all exist. They no longer change together. So, modifiers are a great way to change around your objects very quickly and very simply in the way that they are designed to be used. Let's show you some others real quick. And it applies to the whole object. So if I had this cube and this sphere as an object together, that array would have lined both of them up together. That is important to note. So you have to be in object mode to apply these, so let's stay in object mode. Bevel, see, it's going to add a bevel around all of my edges of my object. And you can change it here with these options. Let's just cancel out of that. Boolean is going to cut something, by one object by another object. So let's smush these two together and intersect with sphere. Now, it's going to cut and leave me the shape of everything inside that sphere. Let's apply it, and I'll show you. See? I put that box inside the sphere, and I hit apply, and it gave me all of this. Now, the problem with doing this is I have really ugly topology, because look at this line. It comes here really close on this side, not so close on that side. And I have this huge n-gon here, which I can't loop cut through. This other huge n-gon here, and this huge one here. This isn't that bad for topology. It can do some really, really weird stuff if you're cutting holes and things. Let's change to object mode and undo that. And now we can change this to difference. And difference is the opposite of intersect. So when I hit apply, now it cut that sphere shape out of my cube. If you go back in, if you use simple geometry with Boolean modifiers and you go back in, and you can change the topology to be better, and it can be very useful for that. So I do use it a lot, but I have to be very careful excuse me, how I use it, because you have to go back in and you have to redo the topology to make sure that your shading and materials and everything else is going to come out correct. And then the last one to show you is union. That is going to, this will give you some weird topology for sure. Let's apply this, and look, it gave me an extra sphere, but now this object is all together. And if I go into wireframe, see it cut off the parts where they were crossing over and made this all one shape. And because it's simple geometry, this might be passable. You might want to make these edge loops complete from these vertices, go all the way around, at least this top face. You could do them all the way around so that you can do edge loops around the box if you want to deform it. But there's not too very much work that might need to be done to that to make it a better topology, except for now these are giant n-gons. Remember, an n-gon is a polygon that has, let's switch out of wireframe. An n-gon is a polygon that has more than 4 sides. It's a lot more than 4 sides. So you might run into some trouble with shading it, or with even changing its shape. So let's undo. How many times can I undo? Oh, I'm in edit mode. Okay, now we're back to this modifier before it's applied. Let's get out of that one. Show you some others. Now, the most important ones, in my scholarly opinion, are subdivision surface, right here. That is going to take every polygon and divide it, divide each edge crossing to the other edges by this factor, and it's exponential in the fact that the more times you hit it, it's going to scale up the number of polygons exponentially because of the way that it divides them. And you see it's also smoothing them out, bringing them together. This helps with smoothing out your topology a bit, making things into like faces, making them smoother and more realistic looking by adding more polygons. It helps with shading. Let's go here to, oh, I'm in object mode. Right here, smooth. Now see how good my shading is, where this is not so good. Kind of ugly. Switch that back to flat. Now a couple of tricks with subsurface, subdivision surface, subsurf. If I go into edit mode, I haven't applied this yet, so I still just have a box. It's just kind of showing me what it's going to look like. If I add an edge loop, remember that's Control R, and then I left mouse click, and then I can drag to the side. See how that deforms kind of like a bullet. I'm saying from this edge loop to the edge, that's where I want the curve to be from. That's a good way to get a gentle curve. Even if I take it all the way to the edge, it's still curved and smoothed out. But what if I want this whole side to be a square? Shift E is going to add a crease. And look, I'm pulling that side saying you need to come all the way to this side. Well, it didn't make it exactly a square, but it made that whole face. It took all of it to that face and squished it up against it. That's what a seam does. I might have to select everything. Oh, let's go to edges. And just select these. Oh, come on. Edges. And then, there we go. Now I can get it to a square on that side. and it stays rounded on that side. So adding seams and Control-R, adding edge loops, is a good way to change what that subsurface is going to look like before you apply it. Undo all the way, there we go. Then you can go to Object Mode and apply it, and you're left with all the polygons that it added. Let's undo that and go back to our cube. Solidify and skin, those are really helpful as well. Let me show you in a different way. Now I'm just going to draw some vertices by holding Control and left mouse clicking. First, see that I have nothing selected. I'm going to Control and left mouse click, and it's going to, if I hold Control and left mouse click, I can just draw these lines with vertices. And then I'm going to Shift and select that first one. Alt-M connects those, remember, and I'm going to connect it last. Now I have this circle, kind of. Now, whoops. L selects whole objects. I'm going to delete those vertices. Now all I'm left with is this as my object. I'm going to add a modifier. I'm going to add skin to it. And see, it just wraps that in a skin. If we go into wireframe mode, you can see it's going to add all of these subdivisions to this. And I'm going to have a lot of polygons that I don't need. I might have to go back in there and erase a lot of edge loops. But that's a quick way to make a line like that solid into a solid mesh. And then you can apply a bevel to it or a subsurface to it to make it even smoother. Let's do that. Apply and subdivision surface. Now I've pretty much got a rope. See? Nice and smooth. But the problem with that, look at that. That's all of those polygons. That's a lot of polygons that you don't need. That's the problem with going crazy with skin and subsurface, because now this whole thing is 27,000 polygons. Why you would need that many for a simple thing like this, I don't know. There's no reason. Do it if you want to. Let's remove that bad boy. Shift S is my snap menu. I'm going to snap my cursor back to the center. I don't know if I said that before. I don't think I did. Shift S. If your 3D cursor gets crazy, Shift S. You can just move it to the center. Or if I want it centered on this origin of this sphere, Shift S, cursor to selected. Shift S, cursor to center, and then Shift S, selection to cursor. I have that sphere selected. I'm going to move it to the center. And let's work with that sphere. Alright, so modifiers. The other one is solidify. So if I have, let's see how I can do this. I'm just going to go into perfect view, deselect everything, turn on wireframe, box select, and take the top of this off. And then now I've got the top of that. And you can see the black reflecting off of the wrong side of these normals. This is the back of the normals. They're facing the wrong direction on the inside of this bowl. So I'm just going to add the modifier skin. What, did it just crash? There we go. Now it just added, oops, wrong one, I'm sorry, solidify. That was adding a box around each of these vertices, and that's why it took so long. Skin is for a line of vertices connected with edges. Let's do solidify. There we go. That one just adds a little edge. Here you can see it, and if I do this, change the thickness right here, you can see it better. It's going to add this edge in to make that flat one polygon thick bowl solid, solidify. And that's what that's used for. You can apply it, and now look, it's even, whoops, go into object mode, apply. It's even connected these for us to give us an inside and an outside. Now it'll reflect light correctly. Go ahead and remove that. And you know what? Let's go back to a sphere. Mirror is great for working on faces that need to be symmetrical. And you can work on one half and then the other half. I'm not going to get too much into that. That's more intermediate. Screw is going to screw around some vertices. See, it did it to this, and now you've got a bunch of overlapping faces. That's why they're freaking out like that. If you ever see anything like that, it's overlapping faces. And then curve is very handy as well. So let me show you curve real quick. Whoops, okay. Let's add a plane in, go into edit mode, and delete it. Now I'm left with this little orange dot. That means I have plane up here, but there's nothing in this object for me to select. If I select it, all that's selected is this origin, which doesn't really exist. So I'll go into edit mode, and I'm in vertice mode. I can hold Control and click to add my vertices. Then I go into add modifier, or then I go to select them all, and Alt-C, I have to be in object mode, Alt-C to change that to a curve from the mesh. Now if I go back into edit mode, you see this is a curve. I'm going to show you two different ways. Then, in object mode, I'm going to add, let's add a cylinder, because it works the best with a cylinder. Let's rotate it by hitting R. Let's rotate it on the Y-axis by hitting Y, 90 degrees. We'll just type 90 and hit Enter. Now let's scale it along the X-axis. We'll just drag the mouse. Let's tab to go into edit mode, and Control R to add some loop cuts. Scroll the mouse wheel up to add more in there. Left mouse click, and instead of sliding them, right mouse click to center them. And then we're going to take this and add a modifier, curve, onto this object based on this plane curve that we created. It doesn't show anything in edit mode. That's because you have to apply it in object mode. Let's switch to object mode, and now it jumps. It's going to place this on that curve. So let's drag it along that curve. Now you can see how it deforms based on the curve that we built. That's pretty cool. It's very useful for creating those curves. You don't have to drag each little vertice to make it. Let's get rid of that curve. And the other way to do it, Shift A, just add a curve in here. And don't scale this along an axis. It'll get a little weird. Just scale it all together. And you can even rotate it. Now let's take this, apply the curve to, or apply the mesh to the curve. And there you go. Now you can scale this mesh object, scale it by every direction except X. So that's, I hit S to scale and then Shift X to say not X. I've got a nice little curvy pipe. And now, if I go into this curve, I'll tab into that curve to edit it. I can grab these, and look how my pipe deforms. And it's only going to deform where I give it a place to. So, see all these loop cuts I added in there? The more you have, the more smooth your curve is going to be. That's all I'm going to do with curve. You would hit apply, and it would apply the curve to your mesh object, and then you wouldn't have to worry about your curve anymore. You could delete it, and then you could use that mesh object. Whoops. I wanted a cube. Okay. Displace is for adding normal maps. That's handy as well. Shrink wrap is really good. But these are all, lattice is good. These are all a lot more advanced. So we're not going to go over them. Now this is your mesh object data. Excuse me. Texture space, You know, you can choose different things here for it, but I mean, don't worry about it. You don't really have to worry about any of this stuff. The one unique thing to notice is double-sided. So if I wanted something, and there's really no need for this, you don't really need to do this. I don't really recommend it, but see how I've got the back of the normal. You can click double-sided here, and it shows your normals as double-sided. Now the lighting will be correct. And I have a box that is 1 polygon thick. That's infinitesimally small. It's super small, and that's why I don't really recommend it. Just add a solidify modifier on there. So then these are your materials, and I'm not going to go too into this because it can get, I mean, there's a lot to talk about with materials. But let's do this real quick. We're going to hit new right here. We have a new material. And look here in my node editor. You can set it right here, node editor. It puts a node in, diffuse, that's your basic color, and the output, that's saying let's show it on the surface. This here is where this diffuse node outputs to our surface node. So you don't have to work over here on your node editor. You can work up here. So I'm just going to stay up here, and you can watch what happens down here. Up here, you can change the color by clicking in this white space. Let's change it to an orange. See, it also changes down here. You can change the roughness. It doesn't do much with diffuse, but it will with glossy. And then settings, you can change this viewport. Click on the little eyedropper to the same color. See, it changes it where I'm looking at it. That's handy as well. You can click this drop down for preview, and it'll show you what your material is going to look like. Now, to start making complex materials, click this diffuse and choose mix. You're going to mix 2 of these shaders together. Now we had a diffuse first, so let's put diffuse back on there, and we can actually borrow this one with the teardropper, with the eyedropper. Whoops, I don't think I grabbed it just right. Okay, the preview is just a little dark. And then we have shader here. Let's hit that minus sign to collapse it. We have shader here. Let's add glossy. And now look, my preview shows it as kind of glossy. This roughness, let's put it at 0.8. So you can see how it gets really, really rough. It'll render out looking better than that, I promise. Or you can do it as 0.01. That's like minimum roughness, just a little tiny bit. It looks super smooth and reflective, like some nice glossy plastic. Or you can do 0, and it takes away even that little bit. I would recommend always leaving at least like a 0.1, 0.2, 0.01, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. Sorry if you can hear in the background, I do have guinea pigs, and they are wanting a carrot. So we add a little bit of glossy on there, and then this factor, how much to factor between the two. Right now it's 50-50 between this diffuse and the glossy. If we turn it up to 80% glossy, now it's barely any of the diffuse. We can turn that down to 0.2, 20% of the glossy, and 80% of the diffuse. Let's put it at 0.4. A nice mixture, a lot of glossy. Now that glossy is reflecting white light. Let's go back in here with the plus sign, and look, right here the color is white. Well, you can make it reflect the same color of light. Hit this teardropper, this eyedropper, and click that color. Now look at my preview. It's much more realistic. The light that bounces back is the same color of the object itself. And when you get more into this, you'll see that you can do even more with normal mapping. Normal mapping shows the bumps of an object without adding new polygons. It's a quick and dirty way to make the light change and make objects look more realistic. So, what if you wanted an image here? Well, let's do that over here so I can show you a little bit with nodes. Let's hit Shift-A, Texture, Image Texture. And you just click where you want this node. We're going to click Open, and we're going to go to wherever you have your image. And let's just do scratch black painted metal. And you're going to open that image of it, and it doesn't change because you have to connect it here. I'm going to connect the color here. And now look, it applied that on there. But the glossy is still this color, so you can't really see it. I'm going to connect that color also to my glossy color. Now it's a nice scratch black painted metal. But it doesn't have all those bumps on it like you would want. So, last thing I'm going to show you with nodes, just because I've been talking about normal maps, Shift A, texture, let's add another image texture down here. Let's give it some more room. And I'm going to go to my recent folder, Scratch Black Painted Metal, and open the normal map. And you would have to learn how to generate these. I'm going to tell it that it's non-color data. Shift A to add in a vector of a normal map, because vectors change something into this blue vector, so I can plug the normal to the normal and the color to the color. Attach. There we go. And now, this is how this can get hairy. There's a lot of different things that you need to do in here. We'll switch to edit mode, and I will select some edges. And Control E to get my edges menu, mark those as seams. You don't really need to remember this at first. I'm going to make a whole UV unwrapping material creation video that's going to be just about as long as this one. So I'm just doing this real quick. Mark those seams, A to select it all, view to unwrap it, and now let's render it. We have this nice box. Oops, one thing that I didn't do is down here. I have my normal map, and I plugged it into glossy, but I didn't plug it into diffuse. Plug it in both places. That way it knows to reflect light based on those bumps, and it also knows to reflect light off the surface of the colors based on those bumps. Now let's do this again. You can see, well, because it's a flat cube, you're not really going to see too very well. Let's add a UV sphere and do sphere projection to unwrap it as a sphere. Let's hit F12. Now you can see it a bit better, and you can see each polygon as well. Let's change that to smooth and re-render it. Now it's even better. There's lots of ways that you can make this much better than it currently is. I'm just going really quick to show you some of the bare basics. You can see how now you can see some of these subtle bumps. I have the normal map not very bumpy at all on this one because I want it to be more subtle, like it's been painted a few times and then scratched. So you get some gouges under the paint, some bumps under the paint, some little impressions where it's scratched off. Alright, and that is the basics for materials. Let's go back into object mode, and if you don't like this, you can, oh, one thing I want to show you, you can just delete it from your object here. Now it has no materials. And go back to new and change the color again to whatever you want. Now if I add a new object, these are different objects. Since I copied it, it's going to copy the same materials, but right here I can click this and I can change the materials of my selected object. So all of the materials that I've created or used are saved right here. So once you create a material on one object, you can switch it pretty easily that way. And if I want to have more than one material on an object, this box here are the materials applied to my object. See, now I have two materials on this object. I could create a new material here. And let's make this one black. And let's go in here to edit mode. And let's look at it from above by hitting 7. Deselect all and hit C and just select these faces, brush those in, and I'm going to hit assign to those. Now my viewport color is also white. Let's just change that to black and go to tab into object mode. Now it has two materials applied to it. on 2 different areas. It's a quick and dirty way to do materials. Let's switch to textures. This is where you can add textures to things. Not really going to get too much into that since we did materials. Particles, this is where you would grow hair. You would hit new, and then you have all these settings. That is also outside of advanced and beginner, or that is also advanced outside of beginner. You can change it from here to emitter to hair. There's a lot more that needs its own video. And here's physics. I'll show you this real quick. And then we'll be done. Scale that up. And now we're going to take this plane and let's add a quick material to it. Hit new, and right here, this little box next to color, you can go up here to texture and click checker or whatever you want, just to put a quick texture on it and change the colors of that. Real quick to make it more interesting. And now these 2 balls, they're not sitting on this plane. As you can see, they're hovering in the air. So to fix that, we're going to go into physics and we're going to hit rigid body. This is active, that means it's going to be moved. Let's hit passive, so it can't move. And now you see this has an orange outline. Let's move it against the dark background. It has an orange outline. I'm going to hit rigid body. It changes to a green outline. And let's change this here. This is what I was talking about, showing the box. Change that to mesh, so that if you have a weird topology, if you have a weird object like a torus, like a donut, or it's a person or something, hitting mesh will put the collision to the shape of the object, so it'll fall more realistically. It also uses a lot more processing power. And we're just going to hit those on to mesh and leave those as active. And now let's change this window to timeline, and you can watch what happens. We'll just hit play, they fall, and they stop. Oh, I applied that particle system to it. That's why you see those little dots flying all over the place. I applied a particle system and I didn't do anything with it. So then they stop and they start rolling. So let's pause it, and they're sitting right on that. Go into our render, and you can set up your render and hit F12. And now you've made your picture with things sitting directly on your surface. That's the easiest way. I mentioned in a previous video the Snap 2. You can use that as well. It works just as well most of the time. I just like to drop objects because I like to watch them drop, I guess. I don't know. And now we did that. Let's go in here. This is going to bug me, and remove that particle system with that minus button. And I'm going to show you again how we did that. So we have this plane selected. I'm going to click on rigid body. I'm going to change it to passive. I'm going to change its shape to the mesh. I'm going to click on this sphere, rigid body, leave it as active, and change this to the mesh. Same with this other one, rigid body, leave it as active, and change the shape to the mesh. Now you can also change its mass, how much it weighs, and how it reacts with these physics. That would be how much they bounce off of each other, how quickly they fly away from each other, how fast they fall based on gravity. No, I'm sorry, gravity is a constant. I forget myself. How much they roll when they hit based on the energy they've collected from their fall, things like that. So now we've applied all that. We'll hit play, and the simulation begins, and you can see them slightly roll. That's pretty much everything for the properties window. I know it was a lot of buttons and it was a lot of time, and I wasn't that much shorter than the last one like I promised, so I'm sorry. But that's everything that you need to get you started, and a little bit with the timeline, a little bit with physics, and a little bit with materials. If you get all that and you understand all that and you can use all that to build your stuff, then I would say you are no longer a beginner. My work is done. Let me know any questions you have. Any comments you have. I would love to see the things that you've created using my instructional videos. Just put a link in the comments. I'm going to be around, and thanks for watching.